Something happened on March 15th, 2023, that signaled the start of the end for the American economic dominance. While most of the nation missed the headline, Saudi Arabia accepted the Chinese yuan for oil sales to China, not dollars, yuan. This single transaction shattered the petrodollar monopoly established in 1974, proving that the foundation of the US dollar's global power is fundamentally broken. This wasn't just a trade deal, it was the entry into stage 6 of a mathematically predictable 8-stage collapse pattern that has destroyed every reserve currency in history. The Portuguese real collapsed in the 1600s, the Dutch guilder collapsed in the 1700s, the British pound collapsed in the 1900s. Now, the US dollar is following the exact same sequence, stage by stage, crisis by crisis. For 500 years, the cycle has been immutable. Reserve currency status is a temporary privilege, lasting only 80 to 110 years. Every time, the dominant power insisted, "We are different, we are too big to fail," and every time they were catastrophically wrong. The dollar is now deep in stage 6. Alternatives are gaining critical mass, the petrodollar is cracking, and the timeline, based on historical precedent and current acceleration, gives us 10 to 15 years before the dollar loses its global dominance entirely. The stakes could not be higher. When that privilege ends, America's ability to print money and export inflation vanishes. The $36 trillion debt becomes structurally unpayable. Interest rates spike. American living standards, inflated by decades of senior, will crash by 30% to 40%. This is the most important economic story of our lifetime, and here is the definitive breakdown. The exact 8-stage pattern that destroyed 3 previous empires, the dollar's precise location. Within that pattern, the specific mechanisms accelerating the collapse and the inevitable timeline. The pattern is screaming that the dollar's dominance is ending. The exorbitant privilege. Why losing reserve status is catastrophic. Before understanding the collapse, we must understand the immense, often invisible advantages of being the world's reserve currency, a status known as the exorbitant privilege. A reserve currency is the primary foreign exchange currency held by central banks globally. Its loss is catastrophic because it destroys the core economic model of the issuing nation, the 4 pillars of dollar dominance. The US dollar S status provides 4 structural advantages that have sustained American living standards for over 5 decades. Structural demand. If every country needs dollars to trade internationally, especially to buy oil, the petrodollar system, they must constantly buy and hold dollars and US Treasury bonds. This creates permanent artificial demand for the dollar, regardless of the underlying US economy. Senior. This is the extraordinary privilege where the issuing country can print paper currency and exchange it for real goods from other countries. The US prints dollars. The world gives the US cars, electronics, and oil. This transfer of real wealth for printed currency directly subsidizes the US economy. Cheap borrowing. Because the world constantly needs to buy and hold US currency, they invest trillions into US government bonds, treasuries. This structural forced demand allows the US to borrow massive amounts of money at artificially low interest rates, far below what US economic fundamentals or debt levels would otherwise justify. Exported inflation. When the US government prints money, the resulting inflation is spread globally because every central bank, corporation, and trading partner holds that currency. US inflation becomes the world's problem, shielding the American consumer from the full consequences of fiscal irresponsibility. The catastrophe of loss. Losing reserve status reverses all 4 pillars instantly, leading to a catastrophic decline in living standards. Demand collapse. The world no longer needs dollars for trade, causing demand for the currency to plummet. Borrowing freeze. There is no longer structural demand for US bonds, causing interest rates to spike dramatically, making the $36 trillion debt unmanageable. Inflation internalization. The US can no longer export inflation. Any money printed causes immediate, severe domestic inflation. Living standard crash. The American standard of living, inflated by decades of senior, crashes back to what the actual non-subsidized US economy can produce. This is the 30% to 40% decline experienced by previous declining reserve powers like Britain in the post-World War II era. This inevitable reversal is why understanding the 8-stage pattern is critical. Stage 1, dominance established, 10800 words. Cumulative. A currency becomes the reserve currency because the issuing country is the dominant economic and military power, establishing absolute trust and stability. Portuguese real, 1500 hoods, established through military control of the global spice trade routes, Goa, Malacca. Merchants needed reals to buy spices, making it the currency of the Indian Ocean. Dutch guilder, 1600s, established through economic efficiency and financial sophistication. The Dutch East India Company was the richest corporation ever. The guilder was the safest and most liquid currency, backed by the world's first modern stock exchange, Amsterdam 1602. British pound, 1815, established through unchallenged military power, defeating Napoleon, and industrial dominance. The Royal Navy controlled the seas, and the gold standard made the pound as good as gold. By 1900, 60% of international trade was invoiced in pounds. US dollar, 1944, established through economic might, 50% of global GDP post-WQHUD and formal agreement, Bretton Woods, 1944. It was formalized through the Petrodollar Agreement, 1974, with Saudi Arabia, guaranteeing global structural demand by requiring oil be bought in dollars. Stage 1 established dominance, but this dominance contains the seeds of its own destruction. 2. The seeds of destruction. Overextension and weaponization. Dominance is never permanent. The pattern shows that the dominant power, convinced of its own exceptionalism, invariably overextends financially and militarily, leading directly to the next two critical stages. Stage 2, peak power and overextension. At the height of power, the dominant country overspends, fights unsustainable wars, and borrows excessively, weakening its fundamentals despite the currency remaining strong due to inertia. Portugal tried to maintain military presence in dozens of ports globally with a population of only 1 million. Debt service consumed 60% of royal revenues by 1560. The Dutch Republic fought 3 costly wars with England and multiple wars with France. By 1700, they were spending more on defense than they earned from trade, accumulating massive debt. Britain maintained the world's largest navy at enormous cost and fought expensive colonial wars. Boer War. By 1914, Britain was a net debtor to the United States. America. Military spending spiraled due to the Cold War and subsequent conflicts. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The Vietnam War forced Nixon to end gold convertibility in 1971. By 2008, U.S. debt reached $10 trillion. Stage 3. Competitors emerge and build alternatives. Other nations, observing the dominant power's overextension and abuse of privilege, begin building parallel systems to reduce their vulnerability and dependence. These alternatives are built defensively, not immediately to replace the reserve currency. Rivals to Portugal, Spain, England, and the Dutch built rival trading companies, English East India Company, Dutch East India Company, that offered better ships and financing, cracking the Portuguese monopoly. Rivals to the Dutch. Britain built financial infrastructure, Bank of England, 1694, and London's financial markets grew, providing a safer, more liquid alternative to Amsterdam. Rivals to Britain. The U.S. economy surpassed Britain's. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, provided an alternative financial infrastructure, making New York a direct competitor to London. Rivals to America. After the 2008 crisis, China created CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System 2015, and Russia created SPFS, its own payment system to rival SWIFT. BRICS nations discussed a common currency. These systems were built explicitly as alternatives should America weaponize the dollar. Stage 4. Currency. Weaponization accelerates decline. Facing challenges, the dominant power uses its currency as a weapon. Sanctions, asset freezes. This inevitably backfires, convincing neutral nations that the currency is unsafe and accelerating the flight to alternatives. Portugal tried to exclude rivals from its ports and seized foreign ships. This forced the Dutch and English to build their own independent port networks. Batavia, Fort St. George, accelerating the collapse of the Portuguese trade monopoly. Britain blockaded Dutch ports during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, 1780-1784, collapsing Dutch trade. Dutch merchants were forced to use London banks, effectively destroying Amsterdam's financial dominance. During WWI, Britain froze German assets, teaching neutral nations that the pound was not safe in wartime. America, the watershed moment. The weaponization accelerated in 2 phases. 2014, Russia, sanctions. Russia was excluded from some dollar transactions and responded by reducing dollar reserves from $130 billion to near zero by 2020, significantly increasing its gold reserves from 1,000 tons to 2,300 tons. 2022, SWIFT cutoff and reserve freeze. America froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves and cut the nation off from SWIFT. This was the nuclear option, and it backfired catastrophically. Every country watching realized that dollar reserves could be seized and their wealth was not safe if they became a political enemy of the U.S. The result was mass de-dollarization. China reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to $775 billion. Central banks worldwide bought 300 tons of gold in 2 years, 2022-2024, the highest rate since the 1970s. Stage 4, weaponization, accelerated the flight from the dollar. The third, the irreversible slide, confidence cracks, and the network flip. Weaponization shatters confidence, initiating the irreversible slide of the dollar's global share. This sets the stage for the most dangerous phase, where the fundamental utility of the dollar, its network effect, flips. Stage 5. Confidence cracks and reserve share falls. Once weaponization demonstrates vulnerability, countries actively reduce holdings of the dominant currency. The decline is visible, consistent, and accelerating. Portuguese real. After rival networks emerged, the real COS share of Asian trade currency fell from 60% to under 20% in 40 years. Dutch guilder. After British military blockades, the guilder ICA's share of European reserves fell from 40% to less than 10% in 35 years, 1780-1815. British pound. Sterling S share of global reserves fell from 60% 1913 to 30% 1940. Bretton Woods 1944 formalized the dollar's replacement. US dollar. The dollar's reserve share peaked at 71% in 1999. By 2024, it is 58%. A 13 percentage point drop in 25 years. The drop is accelerating. The last 2 years saw a 4 percentage point decline. At this rate, the dollar falls below 50% by 2030, confirming the irreversible decline of Stage 5. Stage 6. Alternatives gain. Critical mass and network effects flip cumulative. We are entering this danger zone right now. Alternative systems reach a critical mass, where using them becomes easier, more logical, and less politically risky than using the dominant currency. The network effect, which previously favored the dollar, begins to flip. Flipping point. Petrodollar breach. The critical event was March 2023, when Saudi Arabia accepted Yuan for oil, cracking the petrodollar monopoly. This signaled to the world that oil, the ultimate driver of dollar demand, is no longer dollar exclusive. BRICS and payment systems. China's CIPS system processed $27 trillion in 2023, more than doubling its volume in 3 years. BRICS nations expanded and discussed a common currency backed by gold and commodities. India and Russia now trade in rupees and rubles. The network flip metric. In 2022, 73% of international trade was invoiced in dollars. By 2024, that figure has fallen to 58%. This 15 percentage point drop in just 2 years is the tangible evidence of the network effect flipping. Merchants are choosing non-dollar currencies because their trading partners accept them. The spiral accelerates. IV. The final crisis. Panic diversification in the timeline. Once the network effect flips, Stage 6. The final crisis accelerates the collapse, Stage 7, leading inevitably to replacement, Stage 8. Stage 7. Crisis acceleration and panic diversification. A geopolitical or financial crisis triggers mass panic diversification. Countries dump reserves, the currency crashes, and the dominant power is powerless to stop the fall. Portugal. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, destroyed Portuguese trade entirely. By 1720, the real was worthless outside Portugal. Britain. WTS was the crisis. Britain was bankrupt by 1945, owing $30 billion. The Suez Crisis, 1956, was the final humiliation, where America threatened to crash the pound if Britain didn't comply, proving the currency was subordinate. The pound collapsed from global reserve to regional currency in 15 years. America, the coming crisis. A crisis is imminent, possibly triggered by BRICS currency launch. A credible gold-backed alternative breaks structural dollar demand. U.S. debt crisis, loss of confidence in the $36 trillion debt market, forces the Fed to choose between hyperinflation, printing to buy bonds, or depression, raising rates to attract capital. Banking collapse. A major financial crisis, e.g. commercial real estate defaults, breaks confidence in the U.S. financial system entirely. Any of these could trigger panic diversification, causing the dollar to fall 30% to 50% against other currencies in months, forcing a severe choice on the Federal Reserve. Stage 8. Replacement and new dominant currency emerges. 800 words. Cumulative. The old currency remains, but a new system, or a new dominant currency, emerges. Historical replacement. The guilder replaced the real, and the pound replaced the guilder, often taking 15 to 30 years from the crisis moment to solidify dominance. The dollar's successor. The replacement will likely be a multipolar currency world. 20-25% Yuan, 20-25% euro, 35-40% dollar, and 15-20% gold BRICS currency. The dollar remains major, but the era of single currency dominance ends. The accelerated timeline. The transition will be faster than in previous centuries, 30-50 years. Technology. Digital finance is instantaneous. Countries can dump treasuries and buy yuan or gold in minutes, a process that took weeks in 1914. Existing alternatives, the Yuan, the Euro, gold, and BRICS systems are already built, unlike 1940, when only the dollar was viable. Debt constraint. The U.S. is more indebted, $36 trillion, than any previous declining reserve power, forcing rapid, painful adjustment. The timeline based on current acceleration is 10 to 15 years, 2035, 2050, until the final replacement. V, the Great Transfer. Who wins and who gets destroyed? The collapse of reserve status is the largest wealth transfer in history, shifting trillions from dollar-dependent holders to those positioned in real, non-fiat assets. The winner's gold holders. Historically, when reserve currencies collapse, gold surges. The British pound decline saw gold prices increase 24x. The end of dollar gold convertibility saw gold surge 23x. BRICS nations and commodity exporters. These nations gain economic and geopolitical independence. They can trade in their own currencies, hold diversified reserves, and avoid U.S. sanctions, increasing their global leverage. Countries with low debt, safe havens, Switzerland, Norway, Singapore, and Germany, due to low federal debt, attract capital fleeing the dollar, causing their currencies to strengthen. The losers. The American economy and citizen. The 50-year free lunch ends. The trade deficit becomes unsustainable, leading to fewer imported goods, higher prices, and the inevitable 30% to 40% decline in living standards. Dollar savers and bondholders. If you hold dollar accounts, retirement funds, or U.S. treasuries, you lose purchasing power. A 30-50% dollar devaluation means your wealth loses the equivalent amount of global purchasing power. Wall Street and big banks, the dominance of the U.S. financial sector depends entirely on the dollar. As trade shifts to Yuan and other currencies, transaction revenues flow to Shanghai, Frankfurt, and Dubai. The U.S. government. The inability to finance the $2 trillion annual deficit leads to the choice between fiscally destructive austerity or hyperinflationary money printing. The pattern is clear. The stages are defined. We are in stage 6. The collapse is accelerating, and the cost of maintaining the illusion of stability is the wealth of the American middle class. The timeline is 10 to 15 years. The dollar's dominance is ending. The cycle always finishes.